Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. The Hey Chaplain podcast is the place where members of the law enforcement community share their wisdom and experience through me, the chaplain, so that they can encourage others who wear the badge. On Hey Chaplain, you'll hear from dispatchers and federal agents, sheriffs and U.S. Marshals, as well as local detectives and patrolmen in my hometown of Kansas City. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain deliver advice and insights so that officers everywhere can survive and thrive. When we talk about traumatic experiences for first responders, we usually talk about those rare events of extreme violence and harm that are seared into the memory. And rightfully so. Obviously, traumatic events are traumatic. Obviously. Of course they are. But there are other categories of experiences which can haunt a police officer, and I want to unpack one of those today, the near miss. What happens when a police officer almost pulls the trigger, making a split-second decision correctly not to shoot? It may surprise some, but the supposed non-events can leave a lasting impression as well. Even though, quote-unquote, nothing happened, it may be some of these near misses which stick in your mind for years. So today we'll talk to two veteran cops about near misses. First, you'll hear an account that Major Jim Sutterby told me several months ago, which inspired this episode. Then I had Captain Joe Grasela listen to it, and Joe and I talk about the near miss, about swerving so close to a horrible tragedy, but missing it. So the next few moments will be an excerpt from my first-hand accounts recording session with Jim Sutterby, and then that's followed by my conversation with Joe Grasela. So let me just ask you, give me a notable Christmas or Thanksgiving on-duty type story.
Well, I don't really have one that's from Christmas or Thanksgiving, but I do have a notable Halloween story.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You know, one Halloween evening, I was working in the patrol division. It was a really windy night, overcast. It was starting to get cool, and it was one of those nights where all the leaves are blowing across the street. You can just see the leaves rolling, and got a call of a subject that was refusing to leave at a residence. And I was actually in the traffic unit at the time. I wasn't even in the patrol division, but I was close by, like right around the corner. So I decided, well, I'll jump that call and I'll go help out, and I'm pretty close to it. So I did. I rolled around and into this cul-de-sac, and there's the guy standing in the middle of the street, and a couple of people are out in their front yards pointing at that's the guy right there. That's him, officer. So I get out of the car, and he's standing in the middle of the street holding two grocery sacks. And so I'm trying to get his attention, trying to give him some verbal commands there to get him to put the sacks down and just kind of walk over to me, but he won't do it. He's just staring at me. He's got that stare. Right. And I'm thinking, oh goodness, this is not going to go very well. So he sets the sacks down, and he proceeds to put both hands down into the sacks. Uh-oh. And of course, I'm giving him commands. Hey, show me your hands, show me your hands. And of course, I draw my handgun. I've got it pointed at him, and it's like this whole scene I can remember it as if it happened just earlier today. I remember seeing his hands coming up out of the sack in slow motion. And I can remember taking the slack out of the trigger and preparing my mind that, okay, if he comes up out of that sack with a gun, he's going to be a dead man.
Yeah.
And it was the only time in my career one of the only two times in my career that I can remember coming so close to actually pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
But just the recognition of the fact that I was going to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
You
actually had a moment to think about it.
Yeah, actually had this moment where I'm doing all the things that I'm taught and trained to do, and then he pops out empty-handed. Oh. And of course, it's like the first thing is like, okay, and then it's like, okay, now I got to figure out what am I doing next,
Right,
So
right.
it turned out that we ended up getting him, some other units right on scene. We ended up getting him into custody. Didn't have anything in the sack of anything of any note.
He wasn't dropping
turns out,
contraband into the sacks.
No. It turned out he just having a mental health episode and was going house to house and knocking on doors and basically, he was trick or treating, and harassing people because he wouldn't leave and he was just acting strange. And so, but it was just a memorable. I've never forgotten it in my entire career because it was just the type of night it was. The wind blowing and howling, the leaves blowing across the street, me staring down. It was almost like a gunfight. I'm staring down to him. He's staring down at me. He's holding 2 sacks. I've got. And it's just one of those moments where it's like everything happened in slow motion.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, as you know, Jared, I'm a big Oklahoma fan. Well, OU was playing on this particular night. And I was actually, before I went to that call, I was watching the game at one of our substations. And they were tied when I went in at 7-7. And when I came back out, they were losing 21-7. So the whole night was a disaster, if you ask me. But anyway, kind of a funny story.
Okay, Joe, you just heard Jim Sutterby's story. What'd you think of that?
Spooky. Yeah, that was quite the Halloween story. That was scary.
Well, and it's interesting. Jim has been in law enforcement for many years, and it's interesting that story from relatively early in his career, stuck with him so vividly because technically nothing happened. At least certainly from a civilian point of view. I mean, it was a non-event, but it's the standout kind of event in his mind as a police officer.
Yeah, for sure. And this whole encounter probably lasted a matter of seconds, if definitely less than a minute or two, probably. And him almost replaying it like frame by frame.
Yeah,
like looking at film and going like frame by frame of his thought process, what was happening, what the individual was doing. All those, you can tell he definitely has that imprinted into his mind.
Yeah, it just fascinates me that what I think even cops would consider, nothing happened, I should be fine. It nevertheless made a lasting impression. And Jim didn't indicate, he ultimately called it a funny story, because nothing happened and he's a pretty well-adjusted individual. But it is something that stuck with him. And as a chaplain, my ears perk up a little bit. It's like, oh, how fascinating. You would think only the really bad and tragic stuff would stick with you. And instead, this is something that this near miss, this non-event is what, made such an impression on him, at least at that stage.
Well, for sure. And kind of the way he described it with how he got the call for service, how he responded, everyone's directing his attention to this individual. And then what did he say? It was almost like a gunfighter. Like he's staring this guy down and the guy is not responding appropriately to what he's telling him to do and almost going into a situation which, as police officers were trained to watch the hands, watch the waistband, because that's where things are that'll hurt you. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure in his mind, he's responding to this guy is doing something that's potentially going to attack him or assault him. He's going to pull a gun. He's going to pull a knife. He's going to pull something that's going to hurt me. And to work through that, I'm sure his thought process was, thank goodness I didn't shoot that guy, because obviously that wasn't his intent,
Right.
And so that close call, that near miss, that, situation where he's probably dealing with in his own mind of, this could have gone very badly because it would have been inappropriate to shoot this guy.
Yeah.
And the way he described it. Yeah.
Yeah. And physiologically, his body did not have that information until afterward. Mm-hmm. It's not until afterward he knew the guy was harmless.
Right.
And that he wasn't going to hurt him or somebody else. In the moment, his body was ready for a life or death encounter.
For sure.
And so I think that is the ultimate reason why something like this, why a near miss would stick with somebody for so long.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you have a near miss story.
I've had a few, yeah.
You want to share one of those?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm in my 15th year now in law enforcement, and this particular situation occurred within my first year on the job. So
pretty early.
Yeah, very, very early. And it was kind of a wake-up call to welcome to law enforcement, and this is how things can happen very quickly. And this would have been right after I was, checked off and said, you're good to go from field training. I've been
out on your own.
I'm out on my own. I've been released, and I'm out there to save the world by myself. So I get a shift in kind of the nicer part of our city on the day shift. And it's kind of got the reputation. Thank you, for being kind of a retirement shift. It's all the officers that are retired.
They're too old for this stuff.
The joke was they're retired on duty. So they're all very senior officers. They've got 25, 30 years on the job. They're getting close to retirement. They're not really balls of fire anymore. And here I'm brand new, and I am a ball of fire, and I get put on this shift.
Right.
So I was kind of bummed. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, day shift, I'll have to do my time, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months before I can bid and get out to where I want to be. And I'll just kind of coast through this and learn from them and do my job. But
you expect it to be quiet, though.
Yes. Yeah, I expected it to be kind of boring and mundane based on the other shifts I'd already tasted during my training, because they kind of rotate us around. So this was, I was on this kind of boring shift. It was, the call came out right at the end of our shift, kind of like within the last, I want to say 20, 30 minutes before we were supposed to get off. And myself and another senior officer got sent on, it was coded as kind of like a domestic disturbance call. And if I remember right, there was something to the effect of a woman had called and said her daughter was at a house with her husband or boyfriend, and he was kind of holding her against her will, not letting her leave, and she was worried about him. And then I believe while we were en route, the call kind of got upgraded and said that the woman said her daughter had called, and basically, the guy was armed and acting irrational and was threatening to kill her or something like that. So it kind of elevated us a little bit. So we pull up, granted, this is probably 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, kind of a nice part of town, nothing, looks like a normal house. And the officer that I'm with goes, hey Joe, go around back and take a look. I'm going to knock on the front door, see if I get a response. So I go, okay, no worries. So I start walking around the back side of the house, and as I'm kind of coming around the side of the house towards the back and kind of swinging around and looking, here's Guy. So there's this gentleman coming out of the back door, and he's got in his hand this, at the time, this is the largest, kitchen knife I'd ever seen in my life, like some giant, like a big old fillet knife or a big giant bread knife. Yeah, like a butcher knife, like a big old knife. And instantly, we're trained, and I see that, and my eyes probably were the size of, silver dollars. But I see this knife, and before I even realize kind of what's going on, I realize I have my gun in my hand, and I'm pointing my gun at the guy. And even without really realizing what's going on, I can hear myself saying, drop the knife, drop the knife. So this is kind of just my body reacting without me even consciously thinking about it. So I'm telling the guy, drop the knife. And he looks at me and says, kill me, and then a couple, expletives. Mm-hmm.
He didn't call you by your first name.
No, not at all. He looks at me, and I can remember his expression and his body language was like, like a fighting stance of kind of like, kill me.
Yeah.
Almost like sort of daring me to do it. And I remember having all the slack out of my trigger. And I don't know if your listeners have ever shot a typical Glock handgun, but that's what we carry in our department. And then I remember taking up slack with the actual trigger itself. So I'm beyond that extra piece, and I'm now into the trigger. We shoot basically, if you try, they try to teach us to shoot to trigger reset. So we pull, basically we feel where that trigger is about to break. Mm-hmm. And I was there. Like if a butterfly would have flown by, my gun would have gone off. Like there was nothing left. Like it was going to happen.
Yeah. If it takes 5 or 6 pounds to pull that trigger,
right?
You were already 4.5 in.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was there. Like if somebody down the street coughed, my gun's going off. So it was there. So I remember being there, and now I'm consciously thinking this through. It's not all just my body. And I'm processing this, and it feels like it's that kind of like people talk about being kind of like slow motion. And it kind of felt that way. And I realized that I was ready to shoot this guy if he took a step towards me. And to kind of, I guess, put it in better perspective, I was at a distance from him that I was probably 30, 40 feet. Okay. And I had the wherewithal at the time that I knew that I had a little bit of time to react, that if he were to run at me, charge me.
He wasn't a lunge away.
Correct.
He was a good jog.
Yes,
he would have had taken a couple seconds to
right.
get to you.
And I know, even if you were to shoot someone, with their energy and their momentum and all these different things, they're still a threat. Like they could still get to you and hit you. But I felt at the time that I had enough of a reactionary gap that I would have had time to put multiple rounds into him if I had to.
All right. So let me note a transition. You had instinctual, this is how I've been trained kind of reactions at first that you were almost passive to. Yep. They were happening and you were happening and you
I was part of the audience. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But now higher functioning, you're reasoning, you're evaluating, you're assessing, those things are happening. Yep. And that changes the outcome in your situation, right?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, when I realized that my gun was already out and I'm yelling commands and I'm doing these things, I'm taking a shooting stance. That all really happened without any conscious thought on my part. And not at the time, but afterwards, after the incident had kind of resolved and things had calmed down, I was like, wow, training kind of works. Like it kind of reaffirmed in my mind or reassured me that like they had taught me, I had training. I was ready to react
for the worst case.
I didn't fumble with getting my gun out of my holster. I managed to flip that retention and get that gun out without even a real thought on my part. So that was that muscle memory, that kind of thing was awesome. So it was a cool realization on my part. But at the time, after he told me, hey, shoot me, I realized I didn't necessarily have to shoot him.
Right. It could possibly be de-escalated.
Yes. Or, I had a way of working through this that I didn't necessarily have to shoot him right at that moment. Probably within a couple seconds. It was quick. After he told me that, I did not shoot him. He, standing at the back door, basically turns around away from me and then just flees basically back into the house. So me being a dumb, rookie patrol officer, I instantly take off running after him. And I get to the door and I'm about to go in the door after him. And I had a little voice or a little feeling or something in the back of my mind that was like, don't go in. And thankfully I listened to my, whatever it was. Was it my training officer? Was it my guardian angel? Was it my, something got me. And said, don't go in.
The other officer wasn't immediately right.
He had no clue this was going on, probably, unless he maybe heard me yelling. He was not there. He's on the other side of a house. I was in it on my own. I'm confident that if I would have run into that house, he could have stabbed me, slashed me.
Oh, yeah. Well, you just don't make entry by yourself.
Right. I could have, gotten into a shooting with him where I would have had to shoot him. It could have turned into a situation where, he stabbed or killed the other person in the house because he felt cornered.
Right.
It could have been bad.
Now, several years later, which do you think is more unsettling to you? That you nearly shot him or that you nearly entered that house by yourself?
It's tough. I'd say probably nearly went in because it would have been bad.
Yeah.
It definitely would have been bad. I would have been in an unfamiliar building. He's in there amped up. He's got a big knife. He could have been waiting on just the other side of that door for me. And as soon as I come in, he could have stabbed me.
Yeah. I have the advantage of having heard you tell this story a couple times, and I'm sitting across the desk looking at you, and you look more bothered by the second part of the story than the first part.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And in both cases, that fits our topic, that in both cases, technically nothing happened. But the closeness to having made a fatal mistake, either one that would have killed this suspect or one that could have potentially killed you if you'd gone in by yourself.
Yeah.
Both of those were near misses that leave a lasting impression.
For sure. And, I think I've talked to people and, you see stuff on media, and I think there's this perception by some people that don't really know police officers that they think we're looking for that. Like, they think we're going out there wanting to shoot someone, a suspect, or use force or enter those things. And I can tell you, I'm thankful that in my career I've never had to shoot someone.
Yeah.
I've had a bunch of close calls. I've been in situations where people have been shooting at us. I've been in situations where I've nearly shot people and I haven't. I'm thankful for that. Like I didn't go to work every day hoping that I would be forced into that situation. There's the legal reality of whether it's maybe legally justified, but there's also that realization that you're going to have to carry that weight Like if you take another life.
You could have shot the guy with the knife.
Yeah, I think I would have.
Probably would have been a justifiable shooting.
I think I would have been justified in shooting him based on the situation, his demeanor, his actions, his statements, and where I was in relation to him. I don't think I would have violated law. I wouldn't have violated our policy. But I would have had to carry that weight of taking a human life. And that's something that you don't know what it's like until you have to do it. Yeah. And I'm thankful that I haven't, because I don't know how I'd react. But taking a human life, even when it's completely justified and, arguably necessary, you don't know how you're mentally going to be able to react to that. So.
Yeah. It's interesting to me as a helper. I'm wanting police officers to be healthy and well, and I'm watching them go through some of these near misses, and it should be a good thing that they didn't have to shoot somebody, they didn't have to use force or whatever it was. It was a good thing. They made the right decision. Mm-hmm. They were the slack was off the trigger, but they didn't pull the trigger, and it was a good thing that they didn't. It was a correct decision, and yet they suffer it as if something bad had happened. And not everybody does this, but a percentage of them do. A percentage of them do. They have feelings of distress. It causes emotional harm to them. And they go through all the typical near-miss things that people who survive a car accident or survive, a plane crash or something, they go through, the survivor guilt, they imagine, they get fixated and they fantasize about what didn't happen. Like, well, what if it had gone the other way?
Yeah,
and they spend way too much time thinking about that.
I can tell you that, and luckily in my situation that we're talking about, he went back in the home. The other officer was able to essentially become a crisis negotiator and talked this guy out, talking to him from the front yard. We ended up standing there, like in a barricade for over an hour, I think. Yeah. And Bill was able to talk this guy out peacefully, and we're able to get him into custody without any use of, additional use of force or anything. Yeah. Everything worked out great, in the long run. It was a great resolution. No one was harmed. We were able to investigate the crime. He was taken into custody. No officers got hurt. No victims got hurt. No suspects got hurt. But I can tell you this: if things went differently, and the same situation occurred, and I didn't shoot him, and then he went back into that house and murdered her, I would have had to carry that, and that would have been rough. So I'm thankful it didn't work that way, but.
Well, and that's what I worry about with cops too, is that they are in a lot of lose-lose situations. Mm-hmm. Do you take this person's life, or do you risk them taking someone else's life? I mean, ultimately, that's the reason to employ lethal force, is to prevent the loss of innocent life.
Yes. Yep.
But you can't know. You can't know on the backside of the house that the potential victim is not running out the front door.
For sure.
Or that there's not a room full of potential victims. You just don't know.
So I think that would have weighed on me significantly if like I said, in my situation, I didn't shoot him, and then some other negative outcome came out of that because I didn't use deadly force. Yeah. That would have been awful, and that would have been probably hard to overcome. Yeah. But I'm thankful it didn't.
Both branches of that fork could have led to you, regretting your actions.
Yes.
So it's lose-lose.
For sure.
So let's say you do survive it. You have this near miss. What kind of things do you do to stay healthy and to have the right attitude, the right mindset about it? What would you recommend to a younger officer?
Yeah, I was the youngest you could be at that time. I was probably 23 years old, brand new police officer. I remember talking with, the other officers on my shift and my supervisors about the experience. Obviously, I had to generate reports and document what I did. I kind of had a thought, I was in a long-term relationship at the time with I had a girlfriend, and she was living in a different city, and I kind of wondered, should I tell her about this? And it was one of those things where it would probably be good to vocalize it and work it. I process things better when I talk through them.
Yes.
But I had the thought of, do I tell this story to her because it's probably going to put her more into stress and fear and concern for me and my choice of a profession, because I was brand new in this career. Yeah, yeah. And ultimately, I think I told her, but I don't think I told her in any level of detail.
Right. Which is probably a good balance.
Probably.
Talk about it, but don't get into the gritty details.
Right.
Yeah.
So I did kind of tell her about it. Like I said, I talked with my coworkers. I talked with friends. My other academy classmates that were now working in different parts of the city, working different places. I told a couple of them my story and kind of how it went down, and almost got their, affirmation, or their kind of like, hey, yeah, good job, or hey, that was kind of crazy, or just talking through it, and their, them telling me a similar story that they had, some other type of situation that they had since they got released on their own.
Right.
So that was good. Just the kind of like the physiological responses were crazy for me. So I remember getting home, getting off work, coming home. I think I changed out of my uniform and sat down on the couch, and I didn't pass out, but I fell asleep instantly.
Right.
I had the adrenaline wore off, and I had this like physiological response where I remember almost having convulsions, like shakes, within my arms and legs, like I was shivering. For probably a minute or two, not super long, but it felt like a long time.
Right.
And then I remember just feeling completely exhausted, and I fell asleep on the couch in the middle of the afternoon, and I probably slept 3 or 4 hours, dead to the world asleep.
Not normal.
Yeah. That wasn't my norm at the time.
Right.
And just crashed out on the couch, fell asleep, woke up, felt pretty rested, felt good. And then, felt pretty normal, but it was wild. I had never had that kind of adrenaline dump before.
But that is a normal physiological response. For sure. I worry, and I've had officers come to me and they're like, well, I don't want to admit to anybody that this is the things I felt and how my body reacted and how my emotions reacted.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I really wish you would talk to some others, because most of your fellow
We've all felt it.
have been through that, right?
We've all felt it. So.
And don't let maybe some shifts will have like a machismo or something that at least the perception is that there's we don't talk about that, and there's certainly the belief that old school never talked about these kind of things, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but certainly now just talk to somebody you trust.
Yeah.
And odds are, if they've been in law enforcement, they've experienced the same thing.
Yeah.
And so
for sure.
that's not unusual.
Like you, I mean, you're there for people when they want to talk. And like I said, for me, I know for sure that I do better on processing things when I talk them through. And if I'm talking to somebody else and kind of getting their feedback and throwing things out there, and I'm thinking, even right now, as we're talking, I am processing that event that happened about 14 years ago. I'm thinking about it. And I'll
send you a bill in the mail.
Talk to somebody you trust, coworker, family member, spouse,
a counselor, a chaplain,
of course,
whoever.
Somebody that you feel that you can confide in, and kind of process your emotions, your feelings. Feelings of fear, feelings of maybe you're ashamed you didn't feel fear,
right?
Maybe you have a reaction that you don't think was natural, and you're like, "What's wrong with me?"
Right.
And
common.
So over the years, I've had, plenty of these kind of similar situations, and your physiological or, your response to them changes over time. It's almost like you acclimate to them, or your body gets used to them in a certain way. And, you don't ever forget your first vehicle pursuit, or your first foot pursuit, or your first time where you almost had to shoot someone, or, those things kind of get embedded in your mind. But as your career progresses, and you do this job for long enough, you're going to have those encounters, and those situations happen more often than you would think, probably. And your body sort of gets used to it over time. So
it
that
gets
first
acclimated to the highs and lows.
Yeah. Just that adrenaline up and down of your body starts kind of getting used to that up and down, up and down, up and down, which can happen multiple times in an 8-hour period, or if you're a firefighter, a 24-hour period. Yeah. And you start to kind of get used to it and know how your body's going to react, and it doesn't hit you as hard. But man, that first time it hit me, it was a shocker.
Yeah. Everybody has their own unique reaction. You can't guarantee that your third or fourth or 10th or 100th time that it'll be better. You might have an unusual outlier type reaction.
Or you could have something that twists it or changes it just enough that it scares you even more than normal.
Yeah. But everybody does react to trauma. And nearly shooting someone is a type of trauma. And so, yes, we're glad nothing happened, but that's still a trauma. One thing I wanted to ask you about too. So I keep saying that technically nothing happened, but actually police departments take note of you pointing a gun at someone. Yeah, right?
For sure. Yeah,
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I can't speak to every police department across the country or the world, but I can tell you in my agency, anytime that somebody points a firearm at someone and doesn't pull the trigger, we're documenting that, and we're supposed to.
Still generates a report.
Mm-hmm, yep. So, we with our agency, we call it an active pointing report, meaning that I actively pointed my firearm at someone, and we have to justify our actions. We have to justify why we did that. What was the nature of the call? What types of resistance, body language, what did they say, that caused you to do this, right? Now, so we have to articulate kind of why we do what we do.
Now, lots of different professions that can have near misses, from airline pilots to doctors to whatever. The going thing is that there should be, and I think in most places there are, mechanisms so that they can anonymously report that there was a near miss. They don't want it to reflect on their ability as a doctor or a pilot or whatever, but it needs to be recorded. And people are skeptical of the police. They're like, oh, well, cops are never going to report that. That they pointed a gun at someone. They're not going to write that report. Why would they write the report?
It creates a data point for you as an individual,
as a cop,
as an officer, that, God forbid, like I said, some point in my career, I am faced with a situation where I do have to pull the trigger and shoot someone. I will have a data point of my history as a police officer of every time I've pointed a firearm at someone and I did not pull the trigger, that I can show that I do have restraint and I do have training. And I am able to evaluate a situation as it unfolds. And a big part of use of force continuum, or officers, using force, is this sort of escalation and de-escalation. We have to be able to be fluid in what we do. A situation now might justify me pointing a gun at someone, but their reaction to that in a fraction of a second later, now I'm no longer there because they're being compliant. Right. So it's a good way to show that we have training and experience, and we have the ability to process these things and take appropriate action. And I'm able to show, like, I'm pulling this number out that this isn't accurate, but let's say 15 times in my career I've pointed a firearm at someone and I have not shot them, right? It shows that I have that restraint and I'm able to process things.
Yeah, it's actually beneficial to you as an officer.
I think so, yeah, for sure.
Someone's saying, oh, he's just trigger happy. Well, wait a second. Actually, I've got years of reports where I have been in situations I could have shot someone and I didn't.
For sure.
And having those reports may save your bacon.
Well, and then on the other stance, or just looking at it in another lens too, the act of me pointing a firearm at somebody in a different context is a crime.
Yes.
In the state of Kansas, it's what we would call an aggravated assault. I'm threatening somebody with deadly, basically threatening their life and putting them in fear that I'm going to kill them. And I have to be able to justify my actions. Even though I'm a police officer and I have been granted this authority to use force, I still have to justify why I do what I do. Because even as a police officer on duty, I could still commit a crime if it's inappropriate.
See, and there's another wellness aspect. It would be, if an officer is by himself, points a gun at someone, he could, if there's not a body cam recording it, he could forget that happened. But it would, I think, be beneficial to sit down and recount what happened in a report. And that report could be a wellness activity of, okay, I am justifying why I did this to somebody. And it's probably fine. It probably is justifiable. But it will help you sleep better at night, knowing that it is justified and that you have a clear conscience, you did the right thing.
Yeah, and even as like a supervisor, anytime we do what we would call a defensive action or a use of force type report on our department, there's an initial investigation that's completed by a field supervisor. So when I was a sergeant, I did that all the time. Whenever my officers would use force, kick somebody, punch somebody, wrestle somebody to the ground, tase them, spray them with OC spray, point a gun at them, I would respond out and have to do the initial investigation of whether it was within policy and appropriate based on what they faced. I've had instances before where officers were kind of in that not really the best justification for pointing a firearm at somebody, and it could be just that it's a training issue and they didn't understand, or they perceived something that as an outsider, me looking at not being invested in that, not being caught up in it, I can go, hey, use it as a training, kind of a learning experience, and go, hey, like, this is how you saw it, but this isn't really what it was. Let's learn from this, and we can be better. So it's not always like a life and death or end of a career. It can be used as a way to make us better at our job. If it's kind of on that like justifiable, but maybe not the best thing that they could have done, which is very common. Like, as police officers, we make mistakes. We do things, we're humans.
Yeah.
And if we can take that and then use it as a way to be better and not make that mistake again, that's what we need to do.
Am I right in thinking that a lot of young officers, people in their 20s right now, that they want that? They want to be coached and taught, and
I think so.
Their mistakes treated that way?
Yeah, I think
I feel like I'm seeing that often.
Yeah, and we're trying to do that as an agency, I think, and maybe a profession as a whole, trying to work with people and
not be so quick to drop the hammer.
Right. Yeah. Not be so focused on the discipline or the holding somebody accountable by taking money out of their pocket or, suspending them, and working through trying to train and coach and mentor and find out what the disconnect was and see if we can fix that.
Yeah.
As a supervisor, I always, thought of there's, mistakes of the mind and mistakes of the heart. I can work with mistakes of the mind. You just didn't process something properly. You made a mistake. You didn't know your policy as well as you should have. You did that kind of thing. I can work with that. I can take that and I can say, hey, this is what you did wrong. This is how you could have done better. This is what I expect of you. And if you keep making that mistake, maybe we need to do something else.
Right.
But I can work with you. It's completely different than that somebody going in knowing that they're doing something wrong and choosing to do wrong. Yeah. Like, I can't do much with that. Yeah. But if it's just something where you meant right and just it didn't work out well, we can work through that normally.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you having me.
Thank you, Jim and Joe, for sharing your examples of near misses. These near misses absolutely have an effect on you, and you can't wait until the single most traumatic, show-stopping event of your career to start talking to your fellow cops about how these things affect you. So start that conversation the next chance you get. Just like you and your buddies might talk about old injuries and compare old scars, talk about the various reactions that you've had to both critical incidences and near misses. And one other note, there is a related subcategory of near miss that some experts call the remote miss. In a near miss situation, it typically makes a deep, sobering impression emotionally, which we've been talking about today. But in a remote miss, you do make a fatal mistake or come very close to danger, but you get away with it. Again, you weren't harmed physically or emotionally, but you were the proverbial bomb tech who snipped the wrong wire, yet you lived to tell the tale. You should have died, but you survived unscathed. Sometimes these remote miss survivors may begin to feel excited and then invulnerable, and this then leads to them taking unnecessary risks. Whatever your situation, and whatever response you're having, talk to your fellow cops more. You'll uncover all kinds of strange things that can be addressed so that you can be healthier and happier. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
And I was a senior guy, and so I put myself there because I figured that's my job.
You're at the end of the line.
I'm a training officer. I was the only training officer of the group of 6, and so I'm taking it. And Jared, there was an auto parts store that was down the street from me. And the rioters were starting to break into it, and there was a woman inside, and she started screaming for help. And I had to make a decision on what I was going to do. And bear in mind that all through this night, I heard officer after officer put out a help call with no response.
Right.
If you needed help, you were on your own. Whatever was going to happen, you were on your own. And I'm not going to tell you that this was the right decision. It's been a decision that it will haunt me forever. But I chose to ignore her in order to protect the firefighters.
Yeah.
That was the choice I made. And I just heard her screams dying out once they bent up the security grate that she had locked herself into her store to protect her store, and they bent the grating up down by the sidewalk and crawled in and broke the glass and got to her. And that's the last thing I hear is her screams dying out. And the only solace I really have is that my firefighters were safe that night.
The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like what you heard here, please share this episode with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening today, and as always, pray for peace in our city.